Paris has a way of turning tragedy into a postcard, beautiful from a distance, unbearable up close. On July 3rd, 1971, the world was told that Jim Morrison was found dead in the bathtub of his apartment. 27 years old, already a symbol before he had the chance to become a man who grows old. The official story settled quickly, almost too quickly, with no autopsy and little public explanation, as if silence itself could serve as evidence. For more than 50 years, that silence did not fade. It hardened. It became part of the legend, a blank space that fans tried to fill with devotion, suspicion, and hope. Some clung to the idea that he escaped, that he simply stepped off the stage and vanished into another life. Others believed the darker version, that he died the way too many artists of that era did, but that the details were kept off the record because the truth was inconvenient, messy, and damaging to the people who were still alive to negotiate contracts, manage reputations, and protect an image. The version you share begins with a claim that cuts through all of that in 2025 something surfaced, police material tied to the final hours in Paris, and that it rewrites the entire story. It frames it as resolved, not debated, not theorized, not discussed endlessly in dim corners of the internet. That is a powerful promise, and it matters because Morrison has always lived in the gap between fact and myth. When an official narrative is thin, the myth does not merely grow, it takes over. To understand why the allegation lands like a punch, you have to return to mechanics of what made the death feel wrong in the first place. A famous man dies unexpectedly abroad. People expect the machinery of the state to engage, doctors to document, officials to verify, something that looks like process. Instead, the public received a story that felt more like a private arrangement than a public record. Even reputable overviews still point out the same unsettling ingredients: the death in Paris, the official conclusion of natural causes, and the absence of an autopsy. That combination is not proof of deception, but it is fuel. It gives every rumor oxygen. Then there's a human layer, the intimate circle that becomes the only doorway into the event. Pamela Corson is routinely described as a central witness, and the changing account around Morrison's final night have fed decades of uncertainty. When a story depends on one voice, every inconsistency becomes an echo that never stops returning. And in the years that followed, other narratives attached themselves to the void, including the nightclub theory, the idea that Morrison may have overdosed at a Paris club and was moved afterward to avoid scandal. It is a theory repeated in media reporting, tied to claims by people connected to that scene, and it persists precisely because it offers a motive that is not cinematic, just practical. This is where the modern revival, in 2025, becomes part of the drama. A documentary series, Before the End, Searching for Jim Morrison, has been circulating on mainstream platforms and listings, reintroducing the mystery to a new generation that consumes true crime and celebrity history, the same way earlier generations consumed bootlegs and underground magazines. A new audience does what audiences always do when they sense a crack in the official story. They press their fingers into it. They look for a seam. They ask who benefited from the silence, and how expensive that silence might have been. If the allegation in your transcript is true, the cruelty is not only that Morrison died, it is that his death may have been handled as a problem to be managed rather than a life to be honored. Not a grand conspiracy, but a chain of decisions made in the dark, where panic and self-protection can sound like mercy. In that telling, the tragedy becomes worse because it is ordinary. A man collapses. People hesitate. Someone makes a call that is not to emergency services, but to someone who can make the situation disappear. And once a disappearance is staged, the legend is no longer an accident. It is a product. That is the emotional spine of this story. The myth did not grow on its own. It was allowed to grow because myth is clean and reality is not. A poetic death is easier to sell than a desperate one. A bathtub is quieter than a club bathroom. A closed casket is easier than questions. And yet, even if the 2025 police file claim remains disputed outside the narrative you provided, the hunger behind it is real. People keep returning to Morrison's final hours because the official account never satisfied the simplest human requirement: to know what happened plainly, and to know that the truth was not edited for someone else's comfort. The official version of Jim Morrison's death has always felt less like a conclusion and more like a lid pressed down too fast. Not because celebrity deaths must be theatrical, but because the mechanics of the moment seem designed to reduce attention. No public medical scrutiny, no clear evidentiary trail, and a timeline that moved like it was being shepherded. When a global figure vanishes in a foreign city, the world expects friction, institutions grinding, questions multiplying, a slow release of verified details. Instead, the narrative arrived prepackaged. Heart failure, bathtub, done. And the speed of done became the first red flag. That's why the unease didn't fade with time. It matured. It turned into a kind of collective memory where people could recite the missing pieces as easily as they could recite Morrison lyrics. No paramedics, no ambulance, no autopsy, no viewing, no photos. A funeral attended by almost no one. Bandmates learning through the press. Each omission became a rung on a ladder, leading away from certainty. And then there was Pam, placed at the center of everything not because she demanded the role, but because the story left no other center available. If your only access point to a death is one witness, the witness becomes a gate, whether she wants to or not. According to the transcript, her account did what accounts under stress often do. It shifted. The details didn't simply vary. They refracted, as if the same night looked different depending on who was asking and what they could do with the answer. One version, Jim feels sick after a night out. They watch films. They go to bed. In the early hours, he coughs blood. In the morning, she finds him unresponsive in the tub. Simple, tragic, almost cinematic. But then other versions drifting at the edges. Friends repeating what they say she told them, hints of heroin. Contradictions about whether she called for help, whether anyone else came, whether it was panic or quiet acceptance. These aren't minor discrepancies if you're trying to build trust. They're structural damage. The story isn't that Pam lied. The story is that the truth became unstable in the exact place where it needed to be anchored. And once the truth can't sit still, people stop treating it as truth. They start treating it as a cover. That's where the nightclub rumor enters. Not like a fully formed theory, but like a stain that won't wash out. The transcript frames it as a comment from a Paris club manager. Morrison found unconscious in a restroom, an overdose, and instead of emergency services, a quiet removal. The details are conveniently thin, but thin rumors survive better than thick ones. Thick rumors can be disproven. Thin rumors can adapt. They slip through the fingers of evidence and come back stronger because they exist in the space evidence never filled. Over time, the rumor gains gravity through repetition. Others heard similar versions. Someone else claims he was still alive when he was carried out. Another says the club couldn't afford scandal. And when a story has motive, it doesn't need certainty to become believable. A rock star dying in a backroom bathroom is not merely tragic. It is reputational fallout. It invites police questions. It invites legal exposure. It invites headlines that don't just stain the dead, but also the living, partners, friends, club owners, managers, and anyone who profited from the Morrison machine. Then the transcript introduces a public spark. Marianne Faithfull's comment about her then-boyfriend Gene de Berturi allegedly being connected to the dose that killed Morrison. Whether you accept that claim or not, it performs a narrative function. It moves a rumor from anonymous fog to named proximity. Once a rumor has a recognizable voice attached to it, it becomes harder to dismiss, not because it's automatically true, but because it becomes socially repeatable. People can cite it. They can link it. They can build around it. From there, the story grows in two directions at once. One path toward the idea of a cover-up, and another path toward the fantasy that Morrison never died at all. The survival theory thrives on the same absences that trouble the cover-up theory. No autopsy means no medical certainty. No viewing means no social confirmation. A closed casket means no communal verification. If nobody important saw the body, people begin to wonder if anybody saw it. The transcript even throws gasoline on that by mentioning a passport anomaly, paper supposedly used after his reported death. Unconfirmed, unexplained, but potent. It's the kind of detail that functions like a rumor-shaped key. It may not open a door, but it convinces people the door is locked. Then comes the psychological glue, Morrison's fascination with disappearance. The transcript invokes Rimbaud, the poet who vanished from public life early. Morrison admired that mythology, an artist who exits the stage entirely, leaving the world to worship the absence. When your subject has openly flirted with the romance of disappearing, the audience becomes primed to see disappearance everywhere. A missing autopsy becomes intent. A rushed burial becomes strategy. Silence becomes proof. And then, with time, the mystery stops being a question and becomes a culture. By the 1990s, the transcript says it's no longer just fans. It's filmmakers, journalists, insiders, people who approach the story with sharper tools and a more modern appetite for reconstructing the past. The Morrison death isn't just an event. It's a narrative franchise, one that keeps renewing itself every time a new generation discovers the doors and asks, "Wait, that's all we know?" Enter Jeff Finn. The transcript paints him as a long-haul collector rather than conspiracy opportunist. Decades of interviews, photos, testimony, an obsession that starts as skepticism and becomes a project. In 2025, his documentary series releases and the mystery catches fire again. Not necessarily because it proves something, but because it gathers the scattered pieces into a shape that looks like an argument. And then it introduces Frank, the upstate New York maintenance worker with the uncanny resemblance, voice, habits, a facial mole in the right place. This is a modern accelerant. The kind of story social platforms love because it can be clipped, slowed down, analyzed, and debated endlessly without ever reaching resolution. I'm not Jim Morrison, except when I'm singing in the shower. We're not that different. Lines like that are perfect because they are neither confession nor denial. They are ambiguity performed. And ambiguity, in this case, is currency. The internet doesn't require proof. It requires engagement. Every frame becomes a forensic puzzle. Every pause becomes a signal. People don't just watch, they interrogate. They want the thrill of discovery, but they also want what the transcript calls out directly: closure. That is a quiet truth beneath the noise. The Morrison survival theory is not about logic. It's about grief with an escape hatch. If he lived, then the story didn't end in a bathroom. If he lived, then the world didn't swallow him at 27. If he lived, then some of the wildness survived. But the transcript is setting a trap here. It lets the audience dwell in the seductive fantasy of survival, just long enough to make the eventual pivot hurt. Because it claims that the real answer, if the 2025 files are real, does not grant romance. It does not grant escape. It delivers something heavier. That Morrison didn't vanish into myth. He was turned into myth by choices made in panic, by people who decided a cleaner story was worth more than the truth. And once you accept that possibility, the mystery changes shape. It stops being did he die? It becomes who rewrote the ending, and what else did they rewrite along the way? For decades, the Jim Morrison mystery survived on oxygen made from absence. No autopsy, no public confirmation, no clean paper trail that could shut down the questions. That kind of vacuum doesn't just invite speculation, it demands it. And in that vacuum, the story splits into two emotional camps. Those who believe he died and the details were hidden, and those who needed to believe he never died at all. But the transcript you shared makes a different claim. It doesn't promise a clever escape. It doesn't offer a poetic twist where Morrison slips into the margins of the world and lives out his days as a quiet nobody. It offers something colder, something procedural. It says the myth didn't happen by accident. It was built piece by piece by people who had made a fast decision and chose a clean legend over a dirty truth. And then it names a turning point, 2025, not as a year of renewed rumor, but as a year of records, sealed French police documents reportedly declassified and accessed by researchers and journalists. This is where the story changes its posture. Up until now, it's been shadows and contradictions. Now pretend to be a file folder on a desk. Stamped reports, internal codes, dates, memo language. The kind of language that doesn't try to move you emotionally because it doesn't have to. It lets implication do the work. According to the transcript, 2 incident reports from July 2nd and July 3rd, 1971 sit inside that declassified set. One file stands out. It described a man, late 20s, found unconscious in the restroom of a private nightclub in the early hours of July 3rd. The details are unsettling not because they're graphic, but because they're specific. Non-responsive, signs of respiratory failure, powder residue on his clothing. No ID, but a description that hits too close to the image burned into culture. Long hair, slim build, American accent, leather jacket. And then comes a detail that makes your stomach tighten even if you spent years hearing every Morrison theory under the sun. The body was removed by a private driver before police or medical officials could arrive. That sentence is a hinge. It's the point where the story stops being about mystery and becomes about handling. A body removed before authorities arrive is not a misunderstanding. It is a decision. It means someone saw what was happening and chose control over protocol. It implies a chain of power operating outside the state, at least for a moment, long enough to move a person out of the most incriminating location possible. The transcript notes that part of the report was redacted. Again, rhetorically, this is smart. Redaction functions like a shadow cast by a real object. Even if a viewer can't read the names, the existence of a black bar suggests there were names to hide. Then the second report arrives just hours later, and it's the story the world has known for half a century. Jim Morrison found dead in his bathtub by Pamela Corson. No mention of the earlier nightclub incident. No connective tissue. Two events with similar timing, similar age, and a suspiciously clean separation. At this point, the transcript doesn't say, "The police covered it up." It does something more psychologically effective. It points out the absence of cross-reference. If two reports exist in the same window, why would one not mention the other? Why would the earlier incident be treated as irrelevant? Unless it was made irrelevant. Then comes what the transcript frames as the most explosive piece. An internal memo dated July 5th, 1971. Never meant for public eyes, containing a line that reads like confession in bureaucratic code. Subject believed deceased at secondary location. Body relocated post-mortem under unknown instruction. Entry filed as residence scene. Even if you take that with skepticism, the implication inside that phrasing is brutal. Secondary location suggests the place where death occurred wasn't the apartment. Body relocated post-mortem suggests a stage scene. Entry filed as residence scene suggests paperwork was shaped to match the narrative. And suddenly, the entire architecture doubt snaps into a coherent shape, not because it's proven beyond question, but because it explains why everything fell off in the first place. A rock star dying in a bathtub can be treated as tragic privacy. A rock star overdosing in a nightclub restroom is a scandal with collateral damage. A bathtub suggests quiet, heartbreak, and inevitability. A club bathroom suggests drugs, panic, and the kind of accountability people run from. That is why the transcript calls it worse. Because it doesn't elevate Morrison into myth. It drags him back into the most common, most preventable, most painfully human ending imaginable, an overdose that might have been survivable if people had acted differently. And then it makes the accusation that changes the story from rumor to moral indictment. That someone, maybe more than one person, move his body to make the death more acceptable. Not to fake his death, but to sanitize it. Not to erase him, but to protect what he represented. This is where the story becomes a critique of the machine that surrounds fame. The transcript paints the motive as fear, and fear as economics. In 1971, the Doors were not only artists, they were contracts, royalties, negotiations, obligations. A public heroin overdose could collapse the brand overnight. Radio backlash, legal scrutiny, reputational damage. A permanent stain that would swallow the poetry and leave only the stigma. And in the logic of that world, a stage scene becomes a kind of business decision wrapped in emotional language. The transcript says it wasn't a government plot. It was simple, quiet deception. That phrase is chilling because it's believable. Governments are complicated. People in panic make simple choices. Move the body, change the story, close the circle, keep the noise down. When you don't have cameras everywhere, when you don't have social media, when you don't have 24-hour news demanding updates, you can build a myth quickly and let it harden. If you accept the transcript's claim, the most disturbing part is how little it would take. You don't need an army of conspirators. You need one driver, one decision maker, a cooperative doctor, and a closed casket. The myth doesn't require perfection. It only requires that the public never gets an alternative official version to compare it to. That's why the Frank storyline and survival rumors are so useful. Ironically, they distract from a more plausible possibility. They keep people chasing ghosts when the more human answer is right there. He died in a place that would have embarrassed powerful people, and those people chose legacy management over transparency. And this is where the transcript flips the emotional knife. For years, fans who wanted Morrison alive could tell themselves a lack of proof meant possibility. Even those who believe he died could still hold on to the romance of a quiet, mysterious end, an artist slipping away like smoke. But the file narrative destroys both comforts at once. It says he didn't escape. He didn't orchestrate anything. He died young, and the people around him reacted not with heroism, but with fear. Fear of scandal, fear of law, fear of what it would do to the band, the label, the money, the mythology. And once the transcript plants that possibility, it doesn't stop at the event. It pushes into consequence. If Morrison's death was handled like a PR problem, then the myth of Morrison was not an accident of culture. It was a product that people agreed to sell. This is the moment the story stops being about a singer. It becomes about the cost of turning a human being into an icon. Because icons are easier to manage than men. Icons don't contradict you. Icons don't demand you tell the whole truth. Icons don't force you to admit you hesitated when an ambulance might have saved a life. And that's why Solved doesn't feel like relief in this narrative. It feels like grief finally catching up to the real ending. Not an enigma, not a vanishing. Just a tragedy that was cleaned, staged, and sealed, so the world could mourn a legend instead of confronting the messy, preventable way he actually died. And once you see it that way, another question rises immediately, heavier than the first. If one legend was polished this carefully, how many others were, too? If the transcript's 2025 file narrative is true, the most unsettling part is not the act of moving a body. It's how quickly the world accepted the replacement story, and how long it held. We tend to imagine cover-ups as complicated, full of endless coordination and high-level corruption. But the version presented here suggests something more believable and therefore more disturbing. It didn't take conspiracy. It took incentives, timing, and an era that made silence easy. Start with the simplest question. Why would anyone choose to rewrite the scene of Jim Morrison's death? Because in 1971, Morrison wasn't only a person. He was an economic engine. The Doors were still an active property with contracts and royalties in motion. Negotiations and obligations didn't end because a singer died. In many ways, they became more urgent. A scandalous death could destabilize everything. Tour revenue, licensing, distribution, airplay, publishing, even the long-term value of the catalog. A story about heart failure in a bathtub is tragic, but it is also market-safe. A story about heroin overdose in a nightclub restroom is radioactive. That difference matters. Not because the truth should ever be subordinate to branding, but because history is full of moments where it was. The transcript frames the choice as calculated. Protect the product by protecting the narrative. And the reason that feels plausible is because the music industry, like any industry that trades an image, has always understood that the public does not buy reality. The public buys a version of reality that fits the emotional shape they want. A bathtub death, even without evidence, has a strange kind of poetry to it. It aligns with the myth of Morrison as the doomed poet, the lizard king, the man living on the edge of self-destruction until it finally claimed him. It preserves the ambiguity that makes legends commercially useful. It lets people mourn without confronting the uglier details of addiction, panic, and a preventable end. A club bathroom death does the opposite. It strips away romance. It forces a conversation into the most uncomfortable territory. Who supplied what? Who failed to call for help? Who had reason to avoid police? Who had reason to avoid questions? A celebrity overdose is not only a tragedy, it is an investigation waiting to happen. It puts pressure on everyone in the orbit, partners, friends, club owners, dealers, managers, even band associates. It threatens reputations and invites liability. And in a setting like Paris's private nightlife scene, the pressure to keep matters discreet could have been intense. This is where the transcript's worst theme becomes clear. The story isn't about evil masterminds. It's about ordinary self-preservation dressed up as mercy. If Morrison collapsed in a club, those present would face a decision: call emergency services and risk scandal and legal fallout, or handle it quietly and hope the myth protects everyone. Panic can make people choose a second option, and then spend the rest of their lives rationalizing it as a kindness. The transcript even offers an emotional justification through Pam. It suggests she might believe she was doing him a final favor, shielding his parents from a humiliating truth, sparing fans the brutality of an overdose story, preserving the poet image rather than the addict narrative. That justification is morally complicated, which is why it works. A purely selfish motive would be too simple. A motive that mixes grief, fear, and protection is more human, and harder to judge without feeling uneasy. But perhaps the most frightening aspect is how small the infrastructure of the alleged cover-up would need to be. In 1971, there were no smartphones, no social media, no instant photos uploaded to millions of eyes. There was no army of citizen journalists capturing every movement outside an apartment building. The public didn't demand real-time updates. If a handful of people coordinated a story and kept the circle tight, the story could harden before the rest of the world even knew what questions to ask. The transcript emphasizes that all it took was quiet compliance: a doctor willing to sign without scrutiny, an official willing to let the paperwork close quickly, a closed casket that eliminated public verification, and a burial done fast enough that the event became irreversible. Once that happened, the narrative didn't need ongoing maintenance. It maintained itself. Silence became tradition. Doubt became fandom. And then there's the role of the alternative myths, which is almost ironic. For decades, the survival theories: Morrison faked his death, he ran to North Africa, he became another man, acted as a kind of cultural decoy. They pulled attention toward the most extraordinary possibilities. But the transcript's 2025 claim suggests the real story, if there is one, is painfully ordinary. Overdose, fear, staging, and a quiet decision to let the world mourn a legend instead of confronting a messy end. That is also why the alleged cover-up could last so long. Not because it was airtight, but because it gave the public something they wanted. A romantic mystery is easier to live with than a harsh certainty. A myth invites admiration. An overdose invites uncomfortable questions about responsibility and complicity. Even now, people resist the idea not because it's impossible, but because it changes what they have been mourning for 50 years. The transcript points to the aftermath as proof of how effective the story was. There was no reopening of the case, no institutional push for transparency. The bandmates offered limited commentary. Key figures avoided definitive statements. The label stayed quiet. And for decades, the world functioned as if the bathtub story was enough. But enough is not the same as true. If the files described in the transcript exist and are accurately interpreted, then the Morrison legend was not merely inherited. It was engineered, carefully enough to survive scrutiny, vaguely enough to remain poetic, and cleanly enough to preserve value. And that leaves a final discomfort that the transcript quietly places in front of the viewer. If Morrison's ending could be rewritten for optics, then the story is no longer only about Morrison. It becomes about the entire machinery that can take a human death and convert it into a usable narrative. A narrative that sells records, protects contracts, preserves reputations, and turns an inconvenient truth into a beautiful lie. Because once a lie becomes a legacy, it stops feeling like deception. It starts feeling like history. And the moment someone finally peels it back, the loss hits twice. First for the man who died, and then for the truth that was buried with him. If you spend 50 years living with a mystery, you don't just adopt the question. You build your identity around it. That's why the transcript's 2025 solution lands less like a revelation and more like an earthquake, because it doesn't merely add a new detail to the Jim Morrison story. It attempts to replace the foundation. And when foundations shift, people don't respond with simple agreement or disagreement. They respond with emotion, betrayal, relief, anger, denial, and something quieter that is harder to name: grief renewed. The transcript frames the public response as divided, and that division makes sense because different groups were attached to different versions of Morrison. For some, the mystery was a wound that never closed. Any answer would feel like closure, even if it hurt. For others, the mystery was a comfort. It allowed them to imagine Morrison not as a man who died, but as a figure who slipped beyond the reach of ordinary endings. Theories of survival weren't only speculation. They were a way of keeping the door open emotionally. So when a transcript claims the truth is not he escaped, but he was staged, it destroys both the fantasy and the romance. It takes away the escape hatch. It says he didn't vanish into some poetic exile. It says he died in a way that was ugly, common, and possibly preventable. And then it adds a second blow, that people around him allegedly chose to manage that ugliness, clean it, relocate it, reframe it, so the world would mourn the version of Jim that was most profitable and most beautiful. That's the moment fans feel betrayed, not necessarily by Jim, but by the architects of the story, because it suggests that for decades, the public wasn't simply left in the dark. The public was guided into a carefully lit room, shown the curated scene, and told that was all there was to see. And betrayal has a particular texture when it involves art. People don't just listen to music. They attach it to their lives. They attach it to grief, youth, rebellion, identity, and longing. Morrison wasn't only a singer. He was a symbol of a certain kind of freedom. The dangerous, romantic freedom that seems to burn brighter because it doesn't last long. If the transcript's claim is right, then that symbol was polished using deception. It wasn't only myth-making by fans. It was myth-making by decision. On the other side of the split are those who feel vindicated. The transcript speaks of them explicitly. The people who always knew something didn't add up. For decades, they pointed to procedural anomalies, the missing autopsy, the rushed burial, the tight circle, the refusal of viewing, the lack of official clarity. They were dismissed as conspiracy-minded or obsessive. But vindication doesn't feel clean here, because the truth they will be vindicated by is not glorious. It is bleak. Vindication, in this case, comes with bitter payment. You were right to doubt, but what you doubted was a tragedy that was made worse by fear and self-preservation. Then there's a third group, often underestimated, who simply refuse to care what the records say. The transcript nods to them, too, the people for whom Morrison lives in the space between what was and what could have been. This isn't ignorance. It's a choice. For some, the myth is more meaningful than the fact, not because they love lies, but because the myth performs a psychological function. It keeps the art alive in a particular way. These are the fans who will say, even if he died in a club bathroom, he is still Jim Morrison. The records can't change the way his voice feels in a room at midnight. The paperwork can't rewrite what his poetry did to someone when they were 19 and lost. In other words, the myth isn't competing with the truth. It's competing with the need for meaning. And that's where the transcript's deeper theme surfaces. The war over memory. If the stage death claim is true, then we're not only talking about what happened in Paris. We're talking about the ethics of legacy construction. Who owns the story of a dead artist? The family? The partner? The band? The label? The public? And what happens when the people with the strongest incentives also have the strongest control over the narrative? The transcript suggests that the French authorities have declined to reopen the case. That detail matters because it implies a hard boundary between truth and action. Even if documents are public, institutions may not want to relitigate a half-century-old death, especially when key participants are gone, evidence is cold, and the practical value of reopening is limited. But for the public, reopening isn't about prosecution. It's about moral accounting. It's about acknowledgement. It's about naming what the myth cost. Because if a death was staged to protect an image, then the public's grief was shaped like a product. The world didn't just mourn Jim Morrison. It mourned a carefully packaged version of him. The poet dying in solitude is a narrative that keeps dignity intact. The overdose in a club restroom forces a different reckoning about addiction, about industry exploitation, about the people who choose silence when help could have been called. The transcript's final stretch leans into that discomfort. It describes a heavier silence replacing the old mystery. For years, The silence was a blank screen onto which fans could project anything. Now, the transcript claims the silence becomes clarity, and clarity is harder. Mystery can be romantic. Clarity can be cruel. That's why even a solved story may not settle anything. In fact, it may intensify the questions. If the staging happened, who made the call? Was Pam alone in that decision, or pressured by others? Did the club's owners initiate the removal? Did anyone with financial authority, the label management, advise on damage control? Or was it purely the frantic improvisation of people who feared what police and headlines would do? The transcript says the surviving members of the Doors have offered brief acknowledgments without speculation. If that restraint is real, it also makes sense. Speculation invites legal and reputational risk, and it reopens personal wounds. But for the public, restraint reads like avoidance. Silence, once again, becomes part of the evidence people argue about. And so the Morrison myth refuses to dissolve even under the weight of new claims. His music still circulates. His image still sells. His grave remains a pilgrimage site. The brand once built doesn't crumble just because the blueprint is exposed, which leaves the story in an uncomfortable place. A legend that continues to function, even if the legend was manufactured. And perhaps that is the most modern aspect of this entire narrative. We live in an era where people know images are curated, yet still consume them. We know stories are edited, yet still feel them. The Transcript's 2025 solution doesn't merely expose an old deception. It exposes how easily we accept deception when it gives us the version of grief we prefer. Because in the end, the fight isn't only over what happened to Jim Morrison. It's over whether the truth matters more than the myth. When the myth is the thing people have been holding on to for half a century. Once a legend is built, people rarely ask who poured the concrete. They simply walk on it. That is what makes the Transcript's 2025 claim. Sealed documents, internal memos, a stage scene, feel larger than Jim Morrison himself. Because the Morrison ending was curated for optics, then the story is no longer just about a rock star's final hours in Paris. It becomes about the machinery that decides what the public is allowed to mourn. The Transcript points toward an uncomfortable reality. The line between respect and management can be razor thin, and in entertainment, it is often crossed without anyone admitting it. At the moment of celebrity death, there are always forces pulling in different directions. There is grief. There is fear. There is confusion. But there are also contracts, money, reputational risk, and people whose livelihoods depend on the stability of an image. That is why the alleged motive in the Transcript does not require a villain. It requires incentives. If Morrison died in a nightclub restroom, the first threat isn't merely scandal in the tabloids. The first threat is liability. Police questions, drugs on premises, possible suppliers, witnesses who don't want their names on paper. A public death at a club turns private vice into public record. It doesn't just shame the artist, it exposes everyone within reach. The second threat is brand collapse. A heroin overdose, explicitly documented, could have reshaped the Doors from dangerous, poetic rebels into another cautionary tale, damaging airplay, revenue, and legacy. In that environment, the Transcript suggests the cleaner story becomes a form of damage containment. A stage residence scene would avoid the club's scrutiny, avoid implicating the nightlife ecosystem, and avoid placing heroin at the center of the narrative. It would protect not only Morrison's posthumous image, but also the people who benefited from it, management, label interests, and anyone connected to the machine that turned him into a commodity. The grim lesson is how little infrastructure is needed to make that work, especially in 1971. There is no smartphone video, no instant public evidence, no social media flood demanding proof. There's only controlled access. If the body is moved quickly, if the story is agreed upon quickly, if the paperwork is filed quickly, then the myth forms before the world even knows it should ask questions. And once the myth forms, it becomes self-reinforcing. The Transcript hints at this by describing how easily it worked. A cooperative doctor, a closed casket, a funeral attended by few, a family not present, bandmates learning through the press. These are not only odd details, They are the structural support to a narrative that cannot be challenged because no one outside the circle is allowed to verify it. From there, the machine's second function begins: maintenance through silence. Silence is not just the absence of speech. It is an active shield. People close to the event can remain silent for many reasons: grief, guilt, fear, loyalty, legal risk, or simply the knowledge that speaking would trigger consequences without delivering justice. The transcript suggests key figures refuse to talk, that institutions decline to reopen anything, and that even the surviving band members have avoided speculation. Whether that is restraint or avoidance depends on where you stand. But either way, silence keeps the myth intact. And that brings the story to the larger question the transcript raises implicitly. How many other artists' narratives were polished the same way? Not necessarily with body relocation or stage scenes, but with selective framing, softened causes of death, vague official language, sanitized timelines, and PR statements that protect legacy while pushing the ugly truth into the margins. The transcript frames Morrison as a case study in a wider practice: the entertainment system's tendency to convert messy human endings into marketable myths. That practice is not unique to rock culture, and it didn't end with the 1970s. What changes today is the environment. In a world with cameras everywhere, staging becomes harder, but narrative control does not disappear. It adapts. The modern equivalent is not moving a body. It is shaping the first wave of information, choosing what gets confirmed, what gets denied, and what gets left uncertain long enough to become the accepted version. This is why the transcript's claim hits so hard. It suggests that Morrison's myth, one of the most commercially powerful in rock history, may have been constructed not by time and fandom alone, but by deliberate human choices made in the first hours after his death. If that is true, then the Morrison legend is also evidence of how culture can be guided, and how easily the public accepts guidance when it arrives wrapped in poetry. But the transcript also points to something more human than industry critique: moral weight. If the death was preventable, if Morrison was alive when found and could have been saved, then the story moves from tragic outcome to tragic failure. The alleged staging would not merely hide embarrassment. It would hide the moment people chose fear over help. And that is why the transcript insists it's worse. Not because it adds mystery, but because it removes it. Mystery lets everyone stay innocent. If the story is unknowable, nobody has to carry responsibility. But if the story is knowable, if there was an overdose in a club and a decision to move the body, then responsibility enters the room, even if names are never spoken. And once responsibility is present, it changes how you hear the music. It changes how you interpret the last months in Paris, the supposed calm, the notebooks, the walking, the talk of returning home. It turns the myth of the doomed poet into a reminder that poets are still bodies, still vulnerable, still dependent on the decisions of others in an emergency. It makes the Lizard King smaller in a painful way, more human, less protected, more breakable. This is the paradox the transcript leaves you with. The legend survives, but it is damaged, not because Morrison becomes less important, but because the system around him becomes more visible. Once you see the machine, you can't unsee it. And that leads to the question the transcript is building toward. If this is what was done for Morrison, what did the machine do for others, whose stories were just as messy, just as profitable, and just as easy to rewrite when the world was still asleep? Even if every document in the world were placed on a table tomorrow, every report, every memo, every signature, we would still be left with the same uncomfortable truth. Jim Morrison is not simply a man who died. He is a story that people have been living inside for more than half a century. And stories like that do not end cleanly. They don't end because the facts arrive. They end only when the audience is willing to let go. That is why the transcript's final movement feels less like closure and more like a reckoning. It does not ask you to admire Morrison's mystery. It asks you to notice what the mystery has done to memory, to grief, to truth, and to the way legends are manufactured and consumed. If the 2025 files described in the transcript are accurate, then Morrison did not vanish into myth by accident. Myth was chosen as the preferable outcome. And what makes that revelation so heavy is that it is not extraordinary. It is ordinary in the way human beings behave when they are cornered by consequences. When someone collapses and death becomes possible, The moral question is simple. Do you call for help, or do you protect yourself? The transcript suggests that in Morrison's case, protection won. Whether that protection was motivated by money, fear, loyalty, or shame, the result is the same. A human ending was edited, and yet the world accepted the edit, because the edit felt better. A mysterious death in a Paris bathtub is something people can romanticize. It matches the aesthetic Morrison cultivated, and it fits the cultural appetite for doomed artists. It allows the public to grieve without confronting the messiness of addiction and the brutal mechanics of overdose. It even protects the listener from a kind of moral discomfort. If he died quietly, nobody had to fail him. If he died in a nightclub restroom, someone had to decide not to call an ambulance. That is why the argument over the story is so charged. It is not only about what happened. It is about what people prefer to believe happened, and what they are willing to excuse to keep believing it. The transcript notes that French authorities have declined to reopen a formal investigation, and that those closest to the legacy have offered only brief, careful statements. Whether that is understandable caution or strategic silence, it creates the same effect it always created. It leaves the public staring at a locked door, and locked doors invite imagination. They always have. But the transcript also suggests something important. Even with answers, the Morrison legend remains intact. His voice still lives on records. His lyrics still circulate like scripture for certain kind of youth. His grave remains a destination. His image still sells. In other words, the machine does not stop working because the story becomes less romantic. The machine is not built on truth. It is built on attention. And attention survives almost anything. This is where many fans will land in a confusing emotional place, because the new narrative, if accepted, does not erase the meaning Morrison gave people. It changes the context of his last hours, but it doesn't change the feeling of a song. And yet it does change something else. Trust. It forces you to ask whether you were ever allowed to know the artist as a person or only as a product. That question matters far beyond Morrison. Because the transcript is quietly arguing that celebrity culture doesn't merely document history. It edits it in real time. It chooses which version of an artist becomes official, not always for justice or compassion, but for utility. It selects a story that keeps the catalog valuable, the reputation usable, the scandal containable, the brand intact. And in the Morrison case, the alleged editing was extreme enough to feel like a violation, a rewriting of a man's last chapter into something more marketable. If that is true, then the tragedy becomes double. Morrison dies young, already a tragedy. But then his death is repackaged, turned into an image that serves others, another tragedy layered on top. And yet, for some fans, the repackaging may have felt like mercy for a long time. The transcript captures that tension when it suggests Pam may have believed she was protecting his memory, letting the world remember the poet, not the addict. The terrifying part is that this kind of protection can be indistinguishable from exploitation. Both can produce the same outcome, a cleaner myth that benefits everyone except the truth. So where does that leave the story now? It leaves it in the same place every myth eventually arrives, at the edge of choice. You can accept the worst version because it feels more human, more plausible, and more honest. Or you can reject it because the myth has become emotionally sacred, because you don't want Morrison's ending to look like the ending of 1,000 other artists. Or you can do what most people will do, live with both. Let the myth remain in the music, and let the truth, whatever it is, sit uncomfortably beside it. But the transcript's final implication is that the most important question is no longer, how did Jim Morrison die? The most important question is, who decided how we would be allowed to remember it? Because once you understand that remembrance can be engineered, you begin to look backward differently. You start asking what else was polished, rewritten, softened, or buried. You start noticing how quickly narratives form after death, how quickly they harden into official, and how rarely they are revisited once the public has moved on. Morrison's story survives because it has always been about more than a death. It's about the tension between freedom and control, exactly the tension he wrote and performed about. And if the transcript's 2025 revelation is correct, then the final irony is almost unbearable. Even in death, Jim Morrison was not free. His ending was managed. So the question I'll leave you with is not a theory, and it's not a conspiracy. It's a mirror. If the truth is finally on the table, and it's uglier than the legend, do we honor him more by accepting it, or by refusing to let the myth die?